All right, we're live.
Sweet.
Hey, everyone. I know it takes a couple seconds for the sort of stream to start to broadcast, and for everyone that RSVP'd, thank you. But I am here with Rob. Actually, I've never asked you how to pronounce your last name. I can sort of take an Italian best guess, but I'd rather hear it from you.
It depends on where you are, but it's Cancilla in the United States. In Italy, it's Cancilla, and it gets me a way better table at in the restaurants. But no, in the US, it is Cancilla. That's funny because I said your name in a video today, and I was like, did I say it correctly? Is it Fano or how do you pronounce it?
So if I'm talking in Spanish, I say Fano.
Okay.
If I'm talking in English, I say Fano.
Same thing. All right, I went Fano in my video, so I was confident in it though.
Yeah, those are both good. I've gotten some far out there versions. Some people put like the enye on it when I was like, they say fanyo. I was like, where'd that come from? But
I get Cancilla or Cancia a lot is also another one I get.
That one's actually fair. The double L,
Yeah.
It's like someone, yeah, I could see that happening.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining. We're trying something new here. We're calling this series Hiring Behind the Scenes. And really the point is, I'm old. I had DVDs and VHSs, and there was that section in the menu that's like the making of, which was one of my favorites. And this is kind of what we want to do on this show, is like give the behind the scenes of what happens on the hiring process from the executive lens. So you can kind of see a little bit what's going on. And sometimes these things on the surface we can sort of build stories in our heads, and oftentimes they're way less interesting than the stories that are out there.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I'm a big fan of behind the scenes, by the way. I don't know, maybe because I went to film school 20 years ago, but like anything behind the scenes, I think that's a great title. I'm excited about it.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a nice Rob nugget.
Yes. I thought I was going to be Martin Scorsese, and then I realized very quickly into film school that I wasn't going to be. So I changed my degree or my program. But yeah, I mean, if you think about like why I got into content, like there was actually like something back a long time ago that I wanted to do. So here we are.
You know, I learned about like the funky economics of the way schools work by trying to take some classes in the film school, and the architecture program being like, we won't honor those. I was like, wait, why? I was like, I can take electives here that are like word for word the same thing, but if I take it in that building, you won't honor it. And it was basically like they didn't get the money.
Right. You would say it doesn't go to their program. It doesn't go to their funding.
Yeah, it's sort of lessons for how the world works. But cool. So the way we're going to run these shows is the first half roughly is going to be us talking about topics, and then the second half Q&A. The questions do come through here we use StreamYard for the streaming, but you might be seeing us on LinkedIn or YouTube. If the stream on LinkedIn gets a little funky, recommend heading over to YouTube. Their streaming technology historically has been a little bit better, but you'll get the same exact stream. But if it works great, stay on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's awesome. But yeah, so I thought we'd sort of kick it off with this week's theme is going to be around layoffs, and not to be sort of hopping on to the doom and gloom, but there are tactical things you can do, and we want to help people understand some of that a little bit better. I have been I've been part of reductions, but I've also been on an executive team that was taking a company that was 10,000 people down by 10%. And we had to make, very big moves. Actually, I was there twice when it happened, when I was at WeWork, and sort of being in the executive room, talking about like, what was the discussion? How were we making the decisions? What was the process like? How fast was it? So I can talk a little bit about that. And Rob can talk more about, being on the recruiting side, the career advice. And so that's, and we'll, sort of all parts of, it's called like transition, not necessarily layoff. But I mean, for me, one of the things that was kind of the most interesting as soon as that happened, I'll talk about more when it was like a bigger layoff and sort of like rumors started to rumble, right? Because the way that process works is you're in an executive meeting. It's like, we need to save money. Like we're overspending. And then what that happens is that initiates the cascading of a whole series of events, right? So I ran a 4,000 person organization, and I had about 6 or 7 direct reports. I then go to them and say, hey, this is happening. Like, we got to start to make cuts. And so it's like, really, it starts with like spreadsheets and dollars. And it's not even about people. But then, the my direct reports then grab an analyst and say, hey, I need your help.
Sure.
I don't like the word grab. They speak with an analyst and say, hey, will you help me put together this analysis? And before you know it, lots of people know.
I was about to say that this is where the rumors start to it starts to really start becoming, water cooler, as they used to call it, conversation pretty quickly.
Yeah. And that's, and then you start to hear people talk about it. And there's a lot of things that are kind of uncomfortable, but that's kind of how it starts. And that process could take months or it could take a week. I was told like, hey, you need to be back in this room in our next Monday night executive meeting with a spreadsheet that takes your whole spend down by 10%. It's like 1 week.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of crazy how that happens. I mean, so I'm like, what have been some of your experiences on it, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, usually on my side, you start to hear the rumors, you start to hear the conversation. I would say by the time you hear the rumor, it's probably it's farther along than where the rumor is, meaning, it's lagging. The rumor is lagging, if you will. And so I think like starting to get prepared to understand what that looks like for you is important, right? Whether that's something as simple as updating your resume, updating your LinkedIn profile, getting things in kind of your ducks in a row, if you will, right? And recognizing that most likely if it's a rumor, there's some truth to that. And starting to really start to think about like, what does that mean for you? I don't think it's like panic mode in the sense of apply to every job. It's not pack everything up. It's not that, but I think the reality is like starting to prep for what that could mean for you. And really taking a hard look at like, where have you been, how long you've been in the organization. Some of those things are going to matter. Performance is not always the factor, but like there are other factors of time have you been there, as well as performance, as well as other factors that are out of your control. But taking that audit to say, where am I in the business? If you're closer to revenue, probably a little bit better chance. If you're farther away from revenue, that's something else you need to validate or not validate, but consider on where you are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's like, I've oftentimes like broke it down into like, do I make the company money or do I save the company money? Yeah. And to like really oversimplify it.
Yep.
And if you are a salesperson, and then also like, what has my performance been, right? Because there's a few things that happen. Like companies can just do like wholesale reductions of like a whole department. I saw that happen. We're like, hey, look, we have a whole, UX research team for physical spaces. It's like, on a growth, that's an awesome investment. That's like a long-term thing, but we don't like absolutely need that right now. So like, and it's just like a way to make a big move.
Yeah.
So that whole group is gone. Not to pick on UX. I saw some like LinkedIn chatter about that the other day. I believe UX is really important, but like just say XYZ department, whatever it is, right? It's like in a whole grouping, you're not needing to go. And that's kind of like the first move. It's like, what can you do with like big moves that take sort of big chunks? And I think part of your thinking is like, am I in a department that's critical to the business?
Yep. Or are you I've been in a situation where you're in a new role, like a new role for not a new role for you, but a new role for the business. That title didn't exist, 2 years ago. Right. And so like, that is kind of the same thing. Is like, it's great and it's adding value, but is it longer term value? And as a result of what you need today, is that going to be something that we would consider reducing? And so it's sometimes hard because like we have like biases, right? Like we live and breathe this thing in this job and we do it every day for so long. Like you have to take a step back a little bit and say, okay, all the things that you just mentioned and I mentioned, like, how does that position myself and what are my, kind of percentages, if you will? And then based off of that, start to assess how much do I need to be prepping my resume, my LinkedIn, my network, and all of those things. But you can start to get a little bit of a feel about where you are.
That's a really good point. Cause I think it's having that honest conversation of like need to have, nice to have. Yep. I think especially when we like argue to get a position, like argue or fight for like a position and have a position created because we really believe deeply that the company would benefit from this.
Yep.
But if the company isn't crystal clear on its immediate benefit, those are going to be, the places where they're going to make cuts. And I would say that's usually layer one. Like, do we need this? Is this like an R&D initiative? Right. Like another thing that happens is like the company really shifts its mindset from long-term to short-term.
Yep.
And it's like, yeah, sure, that would have gotten us revenue in 3 years, but like we're fighting to survive right now.
Right.
And so, you got to figure out like what that time horizon is for your company. And different companies are different, right? Like the bets Google can make long-term versus the bets WeWork could make at that moment, or
a 10 slightly different in the WeWork category.
Yeah.
Not to pick on WeWork, but
I mean, another thing you could do is try to understand like what is, right? This ties into resumes, right? Oftentimes people say, oh, the department I was a part of didn't get measured. There was no metrics. I didn't know my metrics.
Yeah.
Look, these decisions are very metrics driven.
Yep.
So if you're having a hard time articulating your like empirical impact on the business,
Yep.
that in and of itself is an indicator of kind of like where you might be standing with things.
No, I couldn't agree more. And in one part also to think about that, whether it's just for your resume or if it's actually in this situation, is like, what is also, I mean, coming up with this new idea around like deferred value, and maybe that's not the right word, but like the work that you do maybe doesn't have a metric tied to it, but its value is deferred to somebody else, right? So like I do market research, as a part of an assignment, and I give that to my boss, who then takes it and then utilizes a bunch of other data to evaluate where the market is and a competitive advantage. The value isn't like I didn't do a ton, right? I didn't see the value or the return on my project, but my boss did. It gives visibility to my boss. And so I think like understanding who gets value out of what you do. Is it you personally? And it like, if I do more sales calls, I get a bigger sales pipeline. That's directly associated to, it can help me and the business. But if I do market research, I might not do anything with that research, but my manager can get a lot of value out of that research and then make a bigger decision out of it. And so understanding, to your point, is like, what is the value inside the business? And then how do I articulate that in my resume in a way that shows I understand where the value is somewhere?
Yeah, I love that. Kind of like, how many concentric circles away are you from like bullseye,
Yep, exactly.
I think that's spot on. So another thing I wanted to talk about today is sort of taking control of the process. Like I saw this happen, and it's very easy to fall into like oh my goodness, like I feel like the ground is falling out from under me. But one of the things I saw people really navigate strategically was taking control of the process and like opting into a layoff. And that's something I wasn't sure people are totally aware that you could do that. But you hear about like packages being offered. And one thing I saw that I wanted to talk about today is that honestly, the people that took the packages earlier got better packages.
Sure.
Right? What I've noticed is that companies can be a little more generous at the beginning. Yeah. But once they're at like, because these also come in waves, unfortunately. Companies say, hey, let's just do it once so it's not lingering because that affects the culture. But that hardly ever happens. They generally come in waves, which is a real bummer. But if you're in one of the later waves, the packages tend to get less generous. That's been my experience. What have you seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you can, I mean, it's everything. I think in job search and in career and salary and all is like risk versus reward, right? So like the risk is once you say it, you're now part of a group that you're like, oh, like, to your point, if we're going to do multiple rounds, like this person can be part of that. And so there's a risk and a little bit of like, you're putting yourself out there. But yes, the reward is if you do it at the right time, then you can have a bigger, severance package. And to your point, I don't think a lot of people realize that they can opt into it and say, hey, here's kind of where I'm at, and like understand the business needs and my personal needs. Like, how do we meet somewhere in the middle? And having a transparent conversation with your manager or HR, like, can do a lot. The only thing I'd caveat is like, once you say it, you're you're moving into this category now. And so there's a little bit of risk associated with that.
Yeah, it's not something you can kind of like test the waters on. It's a little bit of a one-way door.
Yeah. But if you feel like, back to our conversation, like if you've done an audit and understand the percentage, like, there's a high risk of your department because of all the things we talked about is going to be eliminated, then that risk is actually pushing you into in a better situation where you're like, I'm in control of this. And there's also something to be said about that, is just having control. Like it was you have control over the situation a little bit to say, I'm going to start the conversation, is extremely valuable, as opposed to what we've unfortunately seen is a lot of people being kind of blindsided, if you will. Oh, I didn't know this was coming. Is a very different situation.
Yeah. And then a lot of this ties back to relationships and like your relationship with your manager.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a very close relationship with your manager, then you can kind of try to have like an off the record discussion. I saw that happen.
Yeah.
Right. And I even saw that discussion directly with people. Sometimes I would facilitate that discussion. It's, hey, look, this is here. This is the package. Right. Like this is where I think relationships, and it's a little bit, I wanted to bring this up also because I saw you did a TikTok on it, Rob, the kind of 2 weeks notice thing.
Yeah.
And giving the 2 weeks notice.
Yeah.
But let's sort of bring that up to relationships. Yeah. Again, like relationships are critical to careers.
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of people forget in situations like this is that relationships are from person to person, not from entity to person.
Yeah. Yep.
So, and you see a lot of the anger is at the organization. Yeah. So forget the company. I'm just going to give them 2 weeks notice. But ultimately, who deals with the consequences of that decision is a human being.
Yeah.
Those relationships transcend the relationship with the organization.
Yeah.
right? So that manager, even though they laid me off, they may quit right after because they were disappointed with how it went down. They go to a new company and then they may want to recruit me back because relationships are person to person, not person to entity.
Yep. And they'll, for those relationships will remember, how it was handled and how you handle it. We can talk about the 2-week noticing, but just how all of that went down, how you professionally handled the layoff, how you responded in that meeting, all of those things will add up into the future. I've had managers that I didn't enjoy working for as when they were my manager and then became friends with them later. And then they've ultimately been like a mentor or an advisor. Right. And so like, there's even like relationships where it's like, I realized this manager I didn't like, he was being constrained by the business that we were in a way that then was coming down on me. But in reality, he didn't even like that. And he wasn't really, part of those decisions. And we ultimately became friends and a mentor. And so I think like, understanding that one, you want to invest in those relationships long term, they can evolve and change, right? So it's not just, it can be peer to peer, it could be, I've even seen situations where you become that person's manager later on. So but I think investing in that and understanding that there are nuances to it as well. It's not always the business. The 2-week notice thing is really interesting to me. I feel like as a system, we have let people down if they are now, the 2-week notice was always a professional courtesy, right? And that in itself. But this idea, and I talked about it in the video, was that like, it may feel like you're sticking it to the company by not giving a 2-week notice. By saying I quit and just leaving that day, it feels like you're sticking to the company, but all you're really doing is sticking it to the people that are going to take over your work and have no visibility into what's going on. And that just creates a bad relationship long term.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think can happen. Like these are very emotionally charged moments. And I'm not in any way sort of saying that they shouldn't be. This is our livelihood. This is our identity. There's a lot of things tied to it. But I do think this is very much one of those situations where cooler heads will prevail. And I see a lot of like knee-jerk reactions that are emotionally driven. Like people hear this stuff. I understand that it's like stressful and it can cause anxiety and have like serious impacts on your mental health. So they just quit. Like, this is how I take control. I just quit. That's really not the best thing to do because you probably walked away from a severance package. You're probably going to like, sure. So you got control for a minute. Like now that uncertainty, and I understand that uncertainty is very taxing emotionally. But there's other ways to take control besides like rushing to the certainty of just like, it's just over. Like now it's not in their hands. It's in my hands. I quit.
I think there's a couple of things there, right? So like even just like financially, 2-week notice often is like a 2-week vacation, right? So I think like, getting that additional pay, like taking the control of like, I'm giving you my 2-week notice, but like, I'm just doing this to preserve the relationships that we just talked about, right? Like, I'm not going to do a ton. I've seen situations where people give 2-3 week notice and then are asked to leave, but then get paid the entire 2 week because you gave the notice, right? And so I think like understanding what are you actually giving up or taking control of. And again, if there's a really toxic environment that you just are not comfortable, like, yes, then quit. And I think there's exceptions to every rule and that you should evaluate your personal experience. But if it's a job that just isn't right, or it's not something didn't go the way you thought your career was going to, I don't see going back to this risk versus reward, right? Like what's the risk and what's the reward? The risk is you damage a relationship that could impact your career later on. I didn't realize this until I got into recruiting. There are very small communities, right? And what I mean by that is like, if you're a B2B marketer, like it's a small community, like they all know each other in a lot of ways. And so like, if you're somebody that leaves without notice, I can assure you that will come up later on in your career. Like people will notice that. And so I think there's also that like longer term risk versus reward that you have to evaluate whether it's the right move at the time.
And as you move up in your career, people will back channel you. If you haven't heard that term before, you will learn it. You think it's like, oh, well, they're going to ask my references. No, they're not. Right? Everyone knows that if you ask you for your references, you're going to give people that are generally going to give you positive reviews. They back channel you, especially as you get more senior and the hire is more risk because you're more expensive. You're getting more equity. They will ask people. They will see where you worked. They will find out. And so those things happen. And even if, I generally, when someone asks me for a back channel on someone that I wouldn't say something positive about, I just don't take the call. Very rarely have I taken the call. Like unless it was someone like I really think it would like hurt their business and they should not hire this person, I generally just won't take the call. But that in and of itself is an indicator.
Yep, absolutely.
Or I had another one the other day where this was someone I worked with at the company that got acquired by WeWork. He sent me a text. He said, "Hey, you're going to be a reference." I couldn't wait for the phone call. I just wanted to glow about this person. Honestly, they must have thought he was paying me, because I would honestly potentially give up a finger to work with him again, because he's so amazing, and because he just always handled himself with grace and, was thoughtful regardless of the situation, and just kept such a great demeanor, such high like respect and responsibility for people, because he understood the value of the relationships.
Yep.
And like, I don't know, I struggle to talk about this, because the way I see it talked about more openly is around like, I don't owe them anything.
Sure.
And I think that's a little bit of the, at least what I find troubling in some of the career discussion. And I understand like taking control of your career comes with a certain amount of privilege. But if you think about, again, the relationships belong to you, your personal brand belongs to you. And I see it really interestingly when people freelance versus are a full-time employee. And there's this like switch that goes off in our heads when we change the nature of the agreement from an employment agreement to like a contracting agreement.
Sure.
It's like, for all intents and purposes, the same. But with one, I feel a total sense of agency and that I'm building something that belongs to me, versus the other, I feel like I'm building something that belongs to someone else.
Yeah.
And there's kind of like a limiter to how much I'll put in. But if you can just always say, this belongs to me, this reputation belongs to me, these relationships belong to me, I feel like you can take more control of it.
Yeah. And I think like do you use the term brand equity, or did you say personal brand?
I said personal brand.
Personal brand. But yeah, I mean, I think like I think there's also like brand equity that you build over time. And I think that's the other thing people kind of forget is like, when you go to a new company, you have to kind of build up this brand equity. And some people call it like a reputation. I like brand equity because I think it's a little bit different than reputation, in the sense of like, it's about your experience, it's about your knowledge, it's about your work ethic, it's about a bunch of other things beyond just your reputation. But I think like understanding what that is and the value of that is extremely important. So it happens on an individual job level. You have to build your brand equity up on an individual job, but then it actually goes from job to job. It's part of your actual career now. Back to this idea about your relationships, people are going to remember how you handled situations when they were tough. Forget layoffs for a second, just how you handle tough situations, tough decisions, tough customers, whatever it may be. And that's all part of how they're going to think about it. And when you build those relationships, you don't have to go ask them for a referral. They're going to call you and say, "Hey, I have a role. I remember that you're good at this." And so it's a very different scenario as you get a manager, senior manager. It's less about applying, and it's about who's reaching out to me, who am I reaching out to, and how are we like connecting where I can add the most value.
I saw it at WeWork, and I was when I got there, we were 500 people. When I left, we were 16,000. So I saw a lot of hiring.
That's huge.
And you would see it. Like, there were certain leaders we would hire.
Yep.
And like their entourage would come with them.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
It's a lot to leave a company, but these were people that were like employed at really good companies. I remember once we got this executive who used to work at Salesforce, and within weeks we were pulling in this like high caliber talent that I just didn't think would ever even consider working at the company. And they just came. He was there, and they're like, "Oh, if he's there, we're coming."
Yep.
And that just speaks volumes for a person and the way that they maintain relationships. And then when things sort of started to go south, I saw how he maintained those relationships. He made sure every single one of them were taken care of before he got taken care of. Even when he wasn't there anymore, he was still making sure that like their careers were looked out for. Yeah. And that was about the relationships with the individuals. The fact that now they were working at a different company was kind of irrelevant.
Yep. I can't always evaluate a manager on their ability to bring people over, because you may have a non-compete, or like there may be other factors. But when I do see it, it's like one of those things I can't hold it against you because of those factors.
Right.
But when I do see with the example you just said, I'm like, that is this is a good sign of a good culture. One, because they're embracing, that person making decisions and bringing on talent. And then number two, the talent is following. And like, if you think about all the things we're talking about, like, it's a big risk and investment for you to leave a job to go to a new job, whether it's on your own terms or somebody else's. And so if you're saying I'm going because that person's over there, that speaks volumes about your leadership. And so I think when you're evaluating an opportunity and you're talking to a manager, potentially somebody that's going to be your manager, you don't want to just ask them outright, but try to look and see, like, are other people on the team, did they come from the same company they came? You can see all this on LinkedIn now, and you can kind of connect the dots and say, okay, wow, these people started coming over when he or she joined. That's really impressive.
So taking it back to the layoffs, like if you've got that level of a relationship with your manager, you can start to have those discussions. Again, it's kind of depending on like their level of connection to like the executive room and where the decisions are being made. But you can be strategic about how you navigate some of those discussions. And I've even seen some people say, look, I'll stay for the transition for 3 months and then I'll go. So they almost like lock in the package, but they set a date for when they're going to leave. So there's a lot of things you can do. And the same goes for, if we want to level it up a little bit to transitioning, you can actually, people think that you can only get severance when you get let go. You can actually get severance when you quit. And it's a very similar thing, right? There's a lot of leverage because the company, especially if it's like a publicly traded company or a venture-backed company, you have a lot of leverage in them needing you to sign an exit agreement, right? That is of high value to a company. So again, you have to navigate it very strategically, but those are conversations you can have, and people do it quite successfully.
My advice is to find somebody that you know that's done it, right? And to try to get some advice from somebody, as in my experience, is because if you try to do it just testing the waters, as we said earlier, because once you test it, you're in it. But you absolutely can, and I think it's like understanding when and how to ask the right questions to get that to your manager, and asking somebody that's been there, done that is extremely valuable.
There's a chapter in Laurie Rudiman's book. Forgetting the name of it right now. We'll link to it or we'll share it when we share out the notes from this. But she talks through how to approach HR. She runs the HR Rockstar podcast.
Nice.
I'll look up the title of her book in a second. But yeah, she gives very tactical advice.
Nice.
On how to do it. Which is, again, empowering as something you can do.
That's awesome. I'm gonna have to read that book. Yeah, definitely get it. I want to read it now.
I'll look it up while we're talking about the next thing. So look, that's kind of how layoffs go. Then like going to the next level, it does start to get like another thing companies can do. This is where it starts to get a little more like icky. Is that there's just things companies can get away with when they do a layoff that they can't get away with. Get away with sounds like sort of gnarly language, but there are laws that protect the workforce that somewhat get lifted when layoffs happen. So like removing or eliminating a position is different than like sort of firing someone for cause. Or not for cause. And so those are things you want to look out for as well, right? And you can start to kind of gauge your relation because they can start to like add people in as a moment, right? Because the bigger the company, the more procedures they have around letting people go. PIPs come into play and things like that. And so this is where now it can get, you want to understand your relationship with your manager. You want to understand your relationship with your peers. If those things have generally been pretty negative and rocky and you don't have performance to back it up, this is their moment where they can kind of take action and sort of bypass some of the typical procedures.
I think one more relationship to look also is like your manager to their manager, right? And has that been a bumpy road? Like, have they come to you? Have they said things, in passing and those kind of things, but understanding what that looks like too, because that can have a massive impact indirectly on you through that person.
Yeah, those things, because people start to weigh in also, like,
of course.
Again, the way I saw it is, especially like at the executive level, you'll start performance reviews is a whole nother category of headaches. We can maybe save that for another day, and that's awful.
That's a longer show.
Yeah, but on the layoff, right? Like I said, the way it usually works is it just cascades down, right? So me as like the sort of point on the org chart for a 4,000 person organization, I then had like 5 direct reports. Let's just say 4 for easy numbers. They had 1,000 person organizations each. Then they had 4 direct reports. They had 250 person organizations each. And it sort of starts to cascade down, down to like pods of, 10, 20 direct reports, which is, realistically what someone can manage from like a more tactical perspective. So all those people are kind of in the know, putting together spreadsheets, again, unless it's a whole like wing of the org chart that's getting taken off. So there's a lot of opportunities to have the discussions, but also lots of sort of branches to try to discern what's going on and see kind of like where you might be.
Yeah, and to your point, like you may get buy-in from your manager, but they're going to have to get buy-in from somebody else, and like there's multiple layers that happens there, and so you have to navigate you have to navigate all of it.
Yeah. So that's kind of the transition on the layoffs, some things that kind of how it goes on, like I said, behind the scenes. Severance packages are a big deal. There's a lot of things that are negotiable. I think if Dan Space was on, maybe he'd fight me on some of these things. I'm of the belief that pretty much everything is negotiable.
Yeah.
There are lots of things that are like 1 in a million that you'll get it.
Yeah.
Still doesn't mean it's not negotiable, but your chances are phenomenally low.
Yep.
And this is one of those areas where you do have leverage to negotiate. The company's not going to want to do it because the HR view is going to be, if we make an exception for you, we're going to have to make an exception for someone else. And that just puts us in a really complicated situation, which is a super fair position to take because you don't want to play favorites. Then you can get in trouble, for, different actions that you sort of gave someone something versus not another. So consistency is really like the safest bet and the fairest. But there may be times that something just really matters to you more than the cash, like health insurance.
Yeah.
You need them to cover your Cobra longer because it's, disproportionately expensive when you pay for it for yourself, which is ridiculous, but that's like a whole nother problem. So there are things that are negotiable. Like what have you seen people like negotiate that was maybe like outside the package?
So timing of health insurance, actually an interesting. Dan actually has a great video from a long time ago where it's like you want to make your last day, whether you're giving your notice or whatever the transition may be, on the first of the month, because then you get it through the entire month. So your insurance is through the entire month. So if you give your notice on the 29th, you may just get insurance for another day. I mean, most likely they'll probably extend it, but you get what I'm saying is like by giving the first of the month. But I've seen a variety of different benefits offered, whether it's PTO paid out, whether it's severance, extending severance, extending time. What else? I've seen educational credits even or other benefits that you can like accelerate, like you would get them annually, but you can get them all at once. Those are probably the biggest ones. I think length of time, if it's a transition and not a layoff, total cash. Oh, bonus acceleration is obviously another one too, right? So like, if it's a quarterly bonus and you're only a week into the quarter, can you get an acceleration on that? And so those are the ones I've seen the biggest.
Yeah, the timing one that you just like is a really important one. And there's also even different versions of like what your last day is. So if you haven't heard the term garden leave before, it's when you're technically employed, you're just not there anymore. So they've extended your employment technically like your last day. And there's lots of strategic reasons you might want to go for that instead of being terminated.
Yeah.
I think Dan's point, again, to a little bit more detail on Dan's point, is insurance is paid at the first of the month.
Yep.
And it's paid up front instead of in the rears.
Yeah.
So if you're employed on the first of the month, now your insurance is covered. Yep. And so that's a really great point and kind of one of the things to understand in the way businesses operate. The other is like your equity investing. I see people say, I don't care. I hate this company. I don't care about their equity anyway. You earn that. Yeah. That was part of your compensation. So if you're like 2 weeks away from a cliff, now what's on the other side of that is the company saying, we need you to start ASAP. And so kind of like managing that tension is tricky. But looking at
also paying for your equity, if you have to pay for it, you have to pay for the options, right? You can extend that payment. So like if you're transitioning out, you can say, hey, a lot of times you have to pay for those options right away or within 30 days, you can extend that. Again, you may not get it, but it's worth asking. And if that helps you financially, then it's worth exploring.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff there, especially, again, around all the other benefits. Let me see. Trying to think if there's anything in particular else that I wanted to cover. Yeah. The garden leave, the sort of opting in, I thought was kind of like a behind the scenes topic that may not feel obvious.
I don't think that's a good one because I don't think most people would know that one. I think that just the understanding that you have that control and what that looks like and how to navigate that I didn't know it until the first time I saw it. I was like, oh, look at you.
It's kind of a pro move if you're ready to do it.
Oh, it is. It's definitely, it's not a rookie move.
All right. Well, we covered some stuff that hopefully was insightful. Now we'll switch over to Q&A and we'll kind of expand it to, Rob's a job search expert, so we can, kind of around the transition and the theme, but we don't have to be stuck to that too much. So I'll read this first question that came from the audience. And now if you have questions, if you're on LinkedIn or YouTube, post them in the comments. Leah's in there fielding some of them, but they'll come through to me and I'll read them off. All right, I left my employer last March due to ethical challenges and a poor reputation. The timing was admittedly terrible. The company's profile continues to spiral, and I am concerned that having worked for the company has impacted my chances, especially as the market is flush with candidates from strong companies. In your experience, is a former employer's reputation a factor in selecting candidates for a position? Is there an elegant way to address this in a resume or cover letter? That's a really good question.
That's a really good question. I mean, well, Dad, I'd be curious. When were you at WeWork? Right. I mean, like, when did
I lived this situation.
Okay. Yeah. So, I think you should answer. You should start here. But I think, like, how was that experience for you? Right. In the sense of, the Netflix, the podcast, all that came out with, content. It was all over the place. So how did that work for you?
Yeah. So look, this is a very real thing.
Yeah.
And this is something I think about a lot, right? Like the logos on your resume that carry a value. And I actually see this a lot, like when people are negotiating. Someone I've done a few shows with, his name's Rob Daniels. If you looked at his resume, it's like he would be the top 0.1% investors ever with the companies that he picked at the stages that he picked them.
Sure.
Like he was at Salesforce early, and then he was at some other company early, and then like all like right before their IPO, he was just like a magician at it. And so, his resume, maybe when he took the job, it's like, oh, that's like a so-so company. And like 10 years later, it actually, it looks incredible. Yeah. So I think all that's to say is that the companies on your resume do have an effect, right? You sort of draft off the reputation of the company. That's why if someone has Google on their resume, you're just like, wow.
There's a halo effect. That's the positive side of it.
And the negative side of it is also true. And so there are ways to combat it. Like what we saw, there was a lot of people who have WeWork on their resume, and especially during that time, it's like, oh, that place was crazy. You just must be like a crazy spender, just like them.
Yeah.
And then what you want to do is you want to try to identify the things the company did well. Yeah. Ideally, you were a part of those. So even though WeWork had a fairly drastic, quick collapse, we were able to grow very, very quickly. And people acknowledge that regardless, even though that was kind of one of the Achilles heels and that cost a lot of money, it was still non-trivial, right? Yeah. To do the amount of sales we were doing, to open 2 million square feet of real estate a month. That wasn't like fabricated, right? That wasn't like fake. That was real. Those were like real. And so find those things that are real, that are impactful, and highlight those, right? And then be able to articulate, your distance from that, right? Yeah. Say you worked at FTX. You're like, well, look, I didn't work for Sam Bankman-Fried. I worked in like this department, and like we were doing really cool things. And I worked. Look, their marketing was pretty remarkable. So I worked in their marketing. We did some like amazing deals. We did it really quickly. A company that had like went from zero to being able to put our logo on a stadium. I negotiated those deals. I was able to make a strong case for us for them to take a bet on a startup. Right? Those are real impressive achievements, even though it was at a brand that would like now be slightly tarnished. So like really hone in on those successes that kind of anyone would objectively say that was impressive, regardless of the fact that you did it there.
Yep. And I think if you can do that, like for me, it wouldn't be a barrier as a recruiter, wouldn't be a barrier to enter, like to like engage in an interview. I may come to that interview with some bias or some questions about what was your impact and like, whatever that brand reputation may be about the company. But I don't think I would let it hold back. I mean, FTX, I don't know. Maybe that may be an exception to the rule.
If you're in the compliance department at FTX, maybe.
Yes. If you were the VP of finance, we should talk or not talk. Yeah. But I don't think you want to call it out. Like I wouldn't go doubling down on your resume and saying I left for brand ethical reasons, or I just feel like let your work speak for itself, and like we'll get there and you can tell us, you know what I mean? Like I wouldn't let that hold me back from taking an interview or calling somebody saying we should talk if their experience is aligned.
The other thing I would say here is I see this a lot. I feel like people they have angst around certain things in their career history, and they almost want to like confess
Sure.
before it's ever even come up.
Yeah.
Right? And I would say you're not being disingenuous or lacking integrity by not volunteering information.
Yep.
Right? And I see a lot of people like want to volunteer the information. I'm just going to front run this. I'm just going to get it out there.
Yeah.
And the majority of the time, you don't need to do that, right? Like a lot of these things, even like gaps on the resume, these things, like we've almost like made bigger deals of them than they are.
Yeah.
If the content's good and you're like hitting all the fundamentals, those things I don't think they typically matter. So unless someone's specifically bringing it up with you, or you have very clear evidence that that's holding you back, I wouldn't worry too much about volunteering it.
Yep. Totally agree. And I mean, I think your resume is this like end all be all document of all your career, if you will, but at the same time, it doesn't need to include every detail. Right. And so, even on the plus side of it, just removing, the negative for a second, even the plus side, it's like, focus on where you added value and impact, right? You don't have to tell us everything you did in the role. If you're a product manager, know as a recruiter, I've come with assumptions about what you did in your role, right? So like, I don't need the entire job description. I need to know like where you added value and impact. And so I think that's also just in general, we need to get away from this idea that I have to explain everything about my career into this 2 to 3 page document.
Yeah. I mean, you want to play to win.
Yeah.
When it comes to job applications. Right. Yep. And what I see a lot of people do is play not to lose. So they like try to preempt the objectives.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, what if they notice that this one time? It's like, play to win. Just put in the best material, put your best foot forward, and don't try to, again, you may feel like you're being honest and it may be something that's like weighing heavy on you, but you don't need to volunteer it.
Yeah. Agreed.
Another question from the audience is probably a little more traditional job searchy, but Rob
just job searchy like it was
a trillion times. Cover letters. In most cases, they're not required. Is it worth the time? Will it help you stand out?
No. Next question. No. If it's not required, no. They're just not going to be read. And even the ones that are required aren't often read. And I know there's like lots of arguments on LinkedIn. If you go in the LinkedIn search and you type in cover letters, there were some people that will tell you, I love them. It makes me, it helps me understand something that's to stand out. The percentage of people that read them versus the percentage of people that don't read them is so small that I really don't think it's worth your time. If it's required, certainly you should do it. But no, even then, it may just get breezed over, or it may be read. Another thing I hear all the time is I read it after your resume. So just know that, like, it's not an order of like, we read the cover letter, then we read the resume. So, if your resume was on the fence or they were like, there's something here, but I don't know, your cover letter may push it over. But again, we're talking a very small percentage of people. And so I would not encourage going and doing it on your own.
That makes me so mad because like the origins of the cover letter was literally the cover to your resume.
Yeah.
Like when you sent a physical piece of paper. So the fact that it gets read after is so annoying.
Well, the original premise was that, before the internet, you mailed in your resume. So the cover letter told the person where this was supposed to go, right? It was like, oh, this person's applying for this role, which, it's kind of ironic now that it's used as something else.
Yeah. So this one for me is really tough because it just like speaks at the core of the subjectivity of job search advice.
Yeah.
Right. There are people that you will ask who will say, I love cover letters. Yeah. I think cover letters are so important. And then you'll hear other people who, I say more people will say like what Rob said. Yeah. So what I've seen sort of from a pattern perspective is if you're engaging like with a recruit, someone who is like a professional at hiring,
yeah,
they will probably not read it.
Yeah.
If you are engaging directly like with a hiring manager, business owner,
yeah,
they tend to value these kind of like extra effort things.
They do. Yep.
But then you're probably not applying online. You're probably emailing in your application. That same content that's in the cover letter could be in the body of the email.
Absolutely.
So that's like another way to think about it. Yeah. But I'd still say the majority of the time, it's not worth it.
The only caveat I'm going to put is if you're going to do it, to have more bullet points than you do text, right? If it's going to get read, it's still going to get skimmed like a resume, and make it just skimmable. And like, I think that's the other, I mean, some of these cover letters that I've seen are like, the first page of a novel, font 7 and there's no space. It's like, that's not getting you anywhere. And it's also very time consuming for you, I imagine.
Another area where they could be valuable is if you're like a career pivoter and you have a little bit of a story to tell.
Yep.
Again, play to win. Like, don't sort of justify why you just came out of school. Like, don't have it be like a bunch of excuses why things might be weird on your resume. That's not the point.
Yep.
Right? Like, that's something that I think people don't realize. I saw this tweet the other day, like, really upset me. I got to work on like not getting upset about these sort of things that are just like, but this person was like, hey, job seekers, and this was a recruiter.
Oh gosh.
Like, if you're going to update your LinkedIn headline and you haven't actually had that job before, make sure you put aspiring in front of it. And I was like, no, don't do that. Who's going to hire that person? Like, if I need a software engineer, I want a real software engineer, not like someone who's hoping to be a software engineer. It's like just you're setting yourself up for another thing. And she was kind of making a point that it was like disingenuous. And I was like, I don't think so.
Sure.
You sort of channel to the market like what you intend to be and the skills you think you have. And so I think if you start to like qualify your credentials in sort of like in advance in this way, I think you kind of hurt yourself. And it's again like one of those like playing not to lose kind of things that I see job seekers do.
The aspiring is interesting. I have mixed feelings on aspiring. If you're a student, I actually like aspiring, though I've gotten many arguments with people about it. But I think to your point about playing to win, it's interesting how that one word became a thing on LinkedIn headlines like 2 years ago. It's really funny. Everyone's on one side. But they have, of course, everyone's on one side, but everyone's on one strong side. No one's kind of like, oh yeah, it's okay. Everyone's like, I hate it, or I'm all on board.
It's one of the binary ones.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a few of these very polarizing ones.
I think for me though, the LinkedIn headline though is, to your point, in reflection now on it, like a couple years, because I think I did a video a couple years ago and a student had it on there, and I was like, for a student, I think I kind of like it. And it was like the first time I had seen it. Since then, I've changed a lot of how I think about LinkedIn headlines, because I think like all your LinkedIn headlines should be is SEO heavy, and as like, what do you want to tell somebody if you just met them? If you have 10 seconds to tell somebody what you are, what is it going to be? And I don't know if aspiring is the right word, if it's the only impression that you're going to give somebody.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to try this feature here where I'm going to show a question on the screen.
Ooh.
Hey, that's pretty cool. That worked. So the summary of this one is, you're pivoting and you were in, background in corporate social responsibility to marketing. All right. And so, pivoting in general is tricky, right? Because you're asking a company to take a bet on you. And so, like, in my mind, your job as a job seeker is to first de-risk it for the company.
Yeah.
And then second, help them understand why them having you on the team increases their chances of success. And so what I tell people is like, you need to build the bridges for the company. So what is it about? Well, first, how far are you pivoting? How can you leverage your past even as domain expertise? So if you're transitioning into marketing from corporate social responsibility, well, getting a job at a nonprofit in their marketing department, you bring like domain knowledge.
Right.
Or you're going to go work at a startup that helps like manage donations for nonprofits, right? You're again leveraging your knowledge and you know how to speak to the customer. But like, what have you seen be successful for pivoters, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super hard to just apply, online where a recruiter is going to review your resume. Like, to be like, as a recruiter, I report to a hiring manager, meaning like I have to go to a hiring manager and say, like, we should interview David. Look at all the experience he has. It meets the requirements of everything you told me. And so a career pivoter, it's very hard to do that, especially on a resume and even a cover letter, right? And so like, I think understanding the chain of how things happen, and like, you got to get to that hiring manager in a different way. And so that's an introduction. It's an email. It's something to get out of this like process that has been built and designed to look for specific skills and then ladder those up. And so I think back to the beginning of this conversation, your relationships, your personal brand, your networking, this is going to be more important than ever when you're making that. And by the way, I've done 4 different industries, right? I've been in nonprofit, I've been in consulting, I've been in tech, and in different roles inside of those industries. And they didn't just happen from applying. And so I say that with conviction, because like, it's not just like being a recruiter that I say that. Most of those I didn't apply for. And I would say working in startups, I think is probably a great example, by the way. So like taking that industry knowledge, startups will often hire more on grit and passion and those other kind of softer skills that can get you past like, some recruiter reviewing your resume. And so I think those are, and then the industry knowledge is going to be huge. And then utilize your networks that are also like, this is where you can go back to your alumni, right? And like play up those other networks that are available to you that may understand where you're trying to pivot to. And that's the last thing I would say is try to find somebody that's actually made that pivot before is another like way to really navigate this in a way that's going to give you like concrete examples of how to move forward.
So I'll parlay this one. Can I say a segue parlay? This one into another topic, but I think could be helpful.
Yeah.
Because I made a TikTok about this the other day and I was sort of making it on the fly and I was pretty impressed with the results. Is AI, the use of AI for job search materials, right? Someone in the comments, but I may or may not have used ChatGPT to help me with my cover letter the other day. I did one where, because I know a lot of teachers are transitioning out of being teachers and trying into corporate. So I wrote a prompt that was like the resume achievement was something like design curriculum for elementary school students of groups of like 10 to 20. And then I asked ChatGPT to help me reword that in a corporate setting and to use language that was more appropriate with someone applying for instructional design.
Yep.
And it sort of helped me translate my skills from sort of one context to another. And like my actual skills and the activities I was doing are practically the same, but I have to sort of jargonify it to where it's going.
Sure.
But so what are your thoughts on some of these AI tools?
I have not personally played around with them enough, but I think your example is spot on of like, because I've helped my wife's in education. I've helped some of her like friends and colleagues transition, try to transition out of education. And it's such a great example because like there's jargon on both sides. Like the jargon that they use in education, I'm like, what are you guys talking about? And so then it jumps out on the paper as not being corporate jargon, which is sad, but it doesn't. Right. And so doing that, if you're not using AI though, I mean, I think like looking at really, this is where you have to really dissect, like someone like go into LinkedIn profiles, right? Go into, look at what other people are utilizing, the words and jargon they're utilizing that are sitting in the roles that you want to be in and capitalize on that. Microsoft used to have that great resume assistant thing that was awesome. And they took it away because that thing was great for doing that because you could identify people's LinkedIn profiles that way. But I think that's the way to do it, whether it is AI or whether you're doing it individually, but you got to really take a step back and utilize their jargon and get away from yours, whatever it may be.
And this is where I think like the original source of like the keywords can't come from. Like, so there is no magical tool that is AI on the side of the company that's looking for these keywords.
Nope, not at all.
That magical tool is a sixth sense that recruiters have. Like they're able to skim a resume and they understand the jargon and like they know they're just looking at them enough and their pattern recognition is very, very good. And they can look at them very quickly. And if you're not using, like if this is a recruiter that's recruiting in hospitality, right? They're seeing words like guests, hosts, and your resume is all about like users and members. It's like, oh, this person's like not even from our industry.
Yep.
And just like that fires off their spidey senses and like, okay, this person's like not, it's going to just take too much to transition them. And so I think those little things make a big difference.
There's something called, I forget what that's called. I've actually done a video on it. But I would recommend that in interviews too, is like listen, there's a little bit of 1 degree separation or to the left, but listen to the terms that they're using, right? So like if you refer to your customers as partners, but they refer to them as customers, and use their language, right? And so meet them where they're at as opposed to utilizing the jargon and language that you're used to. And it'll pattern recognition. They'll be like, oh, this person understands me. They get me. They speak the same language as me. And it's unfair. It's unfortunate that we are that way, but that's the way we're wired.
I think it's called mirroring.
No, mirroring is repeating back, but it's another.
It's like a version of that.
Yeah, but I'm also a big fan of mirroring.
It works. It's kind of annoying when you see it, and like once you sort of like wait, that's what they're doing. Like that's like, but it works.
It's very good when I don't love it for interviewing too much. I actually do a video on mirroring and interviewing though, is if you need a second to figure out what you want to say, is mirror the question back and it'll give you a second. So someone's like, oh, can you tell me a challenging situation with a client? You're like, a challenging time with a client. They'll give you another version of that question and it gives you like an extra 5 seconds to be like, what is the actual answer I want to give?
Actually, that's super slick. Like buying yourself time to pause.
Yeah. And that one works like every time.
Yeah, because then they're hearing themselves like, oh yeah, see, that was a good question. They really liked it. You want to like, don't use that. That's a great question when it's a lame question. But on the interviewing topic, someone did ask. So I'll do this cool little pop-up thing. That was pretty slick. Do you find laughter during an interview shows you are comfortable enough to show your personality, or does it have a negative impact on your professional appearance?
No, absolutely. I'm about going into an interview should be the way your mindset should be is like, it should be conversational for starters. Like you should be going in as like, how do we create dialogue and a conversation and less of a, you have questions and I give answers. Cause like that isn't good for either person. And I think, I mean, don't get me wrong. Don't just jump on the Zoom and start laughing at somebody. That's not going to go over well. But I think like if you can create a natural organic dialogue where something naturally funny happens, absolutely. And I would not at all stray away from that.
I've often said, I'm curious your take on this, Rob. Like I've often said the single most important thing in an interview is confidence.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
I
think that you create that through multiple multiple ways of doing that. I think it's research. It's, it's having a conversation. It's, I think of an interview sometimes as like this is going to sound cheesy, but like as a dance, like you need to know when to take the lead and when somebody else takes the lead. And so like that comes with confidence, but like knowing and having the confidence to be like, this is where I get to ask questions. This is where I can insert myself. This is where there's these moments that happen in interviews. The cool thing about interviews is they follow the same pattern. Like it's almost predictable how they're going to happen. And so once you realize that, you can actually create these little moments. But yes, I do believe confidence and in general, that's why it's like when you're not looking is the best time to be looking because you're the most confident because you're not looking. It's like almost like dating. Like people can like smell it on you. Like, so it's you are a very different person when you're not looking. When you say, I'm going to take a phone call just for the sake of like, I'm open or this sounds interesting, you'll have way more confidence than if you're like, this is the job I applied to. This is my dream job. I need to get this job.
People can sniff it. I don't think we can tell like as a species.
Yeah. And it's not per se that's a bad thing, but when you do come across as confident, that's also why I tell people to take phone calls, even if you're not looking. One, because it's just good repetitions for you because we don't get to interview that much, generally speaking. And so taking calls when you're confident and not looking is going to give you a way different perspective. It also gives you an opportunity like to test things out. Like ask what the salary is before they ask you. Ask a question that you've never really thought about asking and see how it lands. One, when you're more confident, it'll land better anyways. But two, if it flops, well, that's okay. Maybe it wasn't the right one anyways, but give it a shot.
Yeah. I totally agree. Well, we are at 7 on the dot.
All right.
East Coast, a little earlier for Rob.
Yeah.
But I had fun. This was awesome.
Amazing. Awesome.
Thanks for joining, Rob. It goes quick. I'm
gonna get a better camera though. This is like clearly this is not a good side by side. I'm gonna go find a new camera on Amazon. Oh, I'm just gonna grab my other camera.
Like I told you, I had to somehow compete against that like amazing head of hair. So it's like I gotta like up the camera at least. With the material, but so that might be better getting a blurrier camera. Actually, that might be like more to my.
Get a filter for it. No, I'm just kidding. Awesome. Next time we'll both do different filters. This is awesome. Hopefully everybody got some value out of it. There's like really good topics in here. Some of them bigger and longer term, and then some of them are obviously this kind of quick hits, which I think is great on both sides. So hopefully we can do more of this. Hopefully people will join us again, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, comment on the post on LinkedIn or on YouTube, other things you'd like to see. If you are one of the few who's on TikTok and looking for job materials, it has not been on Rob's TikTok account. I highly recommend it. It's phenomenally informative content. What's the handle, Rob? What's the best way for folks to find you?
It's Rob_Cancilla, my last name. But yeah, that's pretty much all across all of my channels is that one. Having that unique last name has served me well. There's not been a lot of people that grab that handle.
You do have a lot of people spoofing you because you have so many followers now.
I looked it up. Yeah, I looked it up the other day. I have 25 accounts that I have had to block that have my name.
That's crazy. But really, really amazing content. LinkedIn profile reviews, resume reviews, interviewing advice, really incredible stuff. And Rob's, a recruiter by day, career helper, job search advocate by night. So really amazing stuff. You should absolutely check it out. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much, Rob.
Appreciate it.
All right, see ya. Bye.